I'm really pleased to introduce to you Jessica Oskey, who is with the Necrason Group and has been a longtime toiler in the fields of the nonprofit world as a nonprofit leader herself and a volunteer, and now as a representative of many organizations in the sector here in the building. And Stephanie Yu is with Public Assets Institute. She is an analyst, and she also is organizing the Vermont First campaign. One Vermont campaign. And she'll talk a little bit about that. But the point here of this session is to get some highlights on what's happening in the building that are of interest to us as a sector, and to look a little bit more deeply at the budget and how to understand the budget, because it's a vital tool for understanding the values of the people in this building, but also where we have there's opportunities to influence the outcome of those vital decisions. So thank you for joining us. Jessica, why don't you begin?
Okay, that is a roll call vote in the House. So I'm Jessica Oskey, I'm with Necrason Group, and we are a firm similar to Amy's firm, but different. And we have about 35 or so clients, and they're all over the map in terms of issues. And when Lauren Glenn said, talk about what's important to nonprofits, I think pretty much everything is important to nonprofits that's going on in this building. We represent, of our 35 clients, about 33 of them are nonprofits, either 501c6s, trade associations, 501c3s, or 501c4s, and we are in every building, every committee in the building. So I think pretty much everything is important. It's hard to narrow it down to, because you're all have different issues. So I picked a few, but happy to talk about anything that's not on my list. The things that I'm going to talk quickly about are healthcare, the minimum wage and benefits cliff, paid leave, and marijuana. Not that anyone except everybody really cares about marijuana. And really all these things are mostly impacted by the budget. Overall this session, there's a cloud over this building, and that is coming from Washington. Everything we're doing could change and be impacted by either policy or budget changes in Washington. And so there's just so much unknown that there's a lot of fear in moving forward with a lot of issues. And I think that's probably some of what you're going to be discussing. And I'm happy to see that you have tissues and cough drops, because everyone in this building is sick, including me. So sorry about my
communal, in case you
I've got my water here. So first on healthcare, everybody, I'm sure you're all impacted in some way by healthcare. The good news, if there is good news, is that just yesterday the Commonwealth Fund, which is a national think tank, released a report that ranked Vermont as the #1 in the country based on, evaluated trends and comparisons in healthcare access, quality, avoided hospital use and costs, health outcomes, and health system equity. And they looked at all 50 states and DC, and Vermont ranked #1 overall, and we ranked #1 in access and affordability, prevention and treatment, and avoidable use and cost. And that may come as a surprise, because we have great needs in all those areas, and yet we're #1 in the country. So that's important to keep in as a backdrop, that we're actually doing better than anyone else. If we were sitting in this room in another state, we'd have more frowns on our faces, I think. So we're #1. We've got work to do. A couple things that stood out in that report is that we have the 3rd lowest percentage of uninsured adults. This is after a number of years of the ACA. We have strong outcomes related to children's health. We have the highest percentage of children with a medical home, highest percentage of children with medical and dental care, preventive visits, and the percentage of obese adults is below the national average. The bad news is that if the current ACA reform bill passes, also called maybe Trump Care or Ryan Care or whatever you want to call it, Vermont's lawmakers are going to have to fight for funding and flexibility that is now the foundation of our healthcare system. It's predicted that we're going to lose $200 million in Medicaid funding. Maybe you've heard this earlier, and you'll probably hear a little bit about it in your next panel. $200 million a year in Medicaid funding. That's a lot of money in Vermont. Right now, we've been struggling, as you've heard, to close a $70 million budget gap. This is going to exacerbate that in a huge way. These reductions would be in the Medicaid expansion population and caps on spending in different areas and cuts to Planned Parenthood. The other thing that's going to change is the eligibility for Medicaid, and it's going to be harder to get onto the program for a lot of reasons, and I'm not going to go into them all now, but that's coming. Of course, the bill's going to be voted on in the House maybe today or tomorrow in Washington, so we don't really know exactly what the outcome's going to be. But one thing we haven't heard is, you've probably heard that Vermont is moving forward with some healthcare reform in terms of payment reform, something called the all-payer model, that's going to move us from a fee-for-service-based system into a pay-for-quality system. And it's innovative, and it could result in more care in the community versus hospital care, so more money flowing to community-based health services to keep people healthy. And that, Vermont has spent a lot of time and energy planning for this change. At this point, we haven't heard that any action at the federal level is going to derail the all-payer model, but anything is possible. And that is, right now, there's a pilot, an all-payer model, or a funding pilot in Medicaid that's changing the way we reimburse for Medicaid, and that's supposed to transition to a bigger pilot in 2019, and so far that is still on track. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the benefits cliff and the minimum wage, which impacts everyone as employers and possibly as employees as well. You've probably heard that there's a push to move to a $15 minimum wage in Vermont. That's not likely to happen this year, and the legislature has recognized that raising the minimum wage would have the impact of giving people more wages, but it would also reduce people's availability to get certain benefits, and they call that the benefits cliff. The benefits cliff occurs when you get additional income from wages that all of a sudden makes you not eligible for like food stamps, home heating assistance, child care assistance, and other subsidies, but your increase in wages doesn't get you further ahead. All of a sudden, you're losing all these benefits. You're going to have to then pay for your heating, pay for more food, and you're not getting ahead. And so that's called the cliff. Once you get to a certain point, you lose all your benefits. And so there's a bill that passed out of House Human Services that's now in appropriations, and I think maybe appropriations may have voted it last night, that would create a benefits slope. And this is the foundation that we need to put in place in order to have the minimum wage not have such a dramatic impact on benefits. And the slope would increase the asset limit for reach up from 2,000 to 9,000, so you could have more assets and still get on reach up. And it would it would exclude certain assets from the limit, including a retirement account, an IRA, or a 401k, like that kind of an account that you would be excluded from your assets, as well as an education savings account, like a 529. So this is I think it's a great step forward, and it lays the foundation for increasing the minimum wage. That's great for people that are going to benefit in their wages. As employers, many of you are going to have to struggle with how can you balance your budgets with increased wages. That's the tension that's in this building, because you are both probably serving people that are going to benefit from this, but you also have employees. And so that's the tension that legislators have to grapple with all the time. The other thing that you may have heard recently, the House General and Military Affairs Committee passed a pared-down family leave bill that would require that all Vermont employees contribute to a program that would provide 12 weeks of paid time off for certain medical situations. The bill calls for a mandatory 0.93% tax on employees' payroll tax. The money would go into a pool that would pay for up to 12 weeks time off for the birth of a child, a serious personal illness, or caring for a seriously ill family member starting in 2019. When the bill was introduced, it also had a mandatory payment from employers. That has been removed, and it's voluntary for employers to chip into this fund. And that is moving through the building. I expect that it will change as it moves, and I think some kind of paid family leave will pass, but what it looks like in the end, I don't know. And I'm going to say something about that end game in a minute. The last thing I want to talk about is just, you've heard a lot about Vermont's efforts to legalize marijuana, and there's something called the tax and regulate model, which would add revenue into the state by taxing marijuana sales and creating like a dispensary model that other states have. The bill that just passed out of House Judiciary Committee that's going to the House floor next week would not be that model. It would just it would decriminalize or legalize little amounts of pot, up to an ounce, or 2 mature plants or 4 immature plants. So it's got a long way to go. Its passage is unclear this year. If it does pass, it probably does take the next steps towards a tax and regulate, which, just from a perspective of looking at the budget, if we had legalized last year and had a new revenue stream, it would make a lot of things easier this year, but may cause additional problems. But the estimates are that, many millions of dollars would come in revenue, and that revenue is now in the black market or going out of state. So it's not that people aren't consuming marijuana now, it's just in a black market system. So those are the 4 that I highlighted. Clearly there's a lot more going on that impacts you. The one thing I want to say, and this follows up to the last presentation that you had, you're here to sort of learn about how to be advocates for the things that are important to you. I heard a very interesting anecdote yesterday in the Appropriations Committee. The House Healthcare Committee had proposed to fund some changes to the mental health system with a cut to some funding to some sector of the healthcare, and when the House Healthcare Committee was presenting to the Appropriations Committee, the Appropriations Committee asked, well, did you hear anything from this part of the healthcare sector? Are they concerned about this cut? And the answer was, well, we didn't take any testimony from them, but after we proposed this, we didn't hear, lots of yelling and screaming. There was no blood in the hallway. So we figured they're fine with it. And as an advocate, there are times when you have to decide how loudly you're going to scream and complain, and whether, there's deference and respect that you owe to this process. You know that this is a hard job that these folks have to balance the budget. But if some proposal is really going to impact you, you need to speak up, and you need to make it really clear about what this is going to do to your business, the people that you serve, because if you don't, it's going forward. And I know that to be true, and I know that I've heard legislators say, well, I've got 50 calls on this, so let's slow it down. It really matters, and this is a small place, and your voices do count, and they are heard.
Thank you, Jessica.
That was fast. I don't know if I covered people on here.
Right? Let's give her a little love. Jessica, a little love. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you. So thanks for having me. So for those of you who don't know, Public Assets is a Montpelier think tank, and we really look at state tax and economic policy, the state budget, but really look at its impact on low and moderate income Vermonters. So again, lots of the people you serve, but really thinking about is the budget working for them, not working for them, meeting their needs, and that's what our role is. But the other thing that we do is we coordinate the One Vermont Coalition, which I don't know how many of you have heard of it. I know there is one member of our steering committee here, Dan Hawksworth from Capstone Community Action is here. But the One Vermont Coalition is a collection of advocates and organizations and individuals. It includes a number of nonprofits. But the goal is really a Vermont that works for everyone. And the idea is that every Vermonter should have equal access to opportunity. But it's not. But the goal of it is really to focus on sort of those big picture issues. And I think this is some of what you've been hearing about this morning. Sort of this idea. I think Danielle maybe used the word turfy. Sort of what are the issues that sort of are above turf? Things that are big picture budget issues, like when our revenue system isn't keeping up, which we're going to get into a little bit. But sort of these broad kind of umbrella issues that all programs are sort of hitting when, for example, when there's not enough resources or when revenues are scarce and we need to be thinking about, kind of a big picture, maybe one fell swoop kind of solution rather than each, advocate looking at their area and trying to figure out how to fund that. So that's the goal of One Vermont. So both of those organizations, if anybody's interested in following us or signing up for our lists or any of that stuff, they're pretty straightforward. It's publicassets.org and 1vt.org. But I'm happy to talk with you more about either one of those. So really quickly, what I'm going to try and do today, and I know we're behind, so I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, but is give you a really quick budget overview and just kind of a really quick high-level stuff. I know you've heard some about the budget gap from various people, and we'll tell you a little bit of why we think that number is a moving target a lot of the time. And then just kind of give you a sense of where the money's spent and how those decisions are made. And I am sorry, we really can't do anything without charts. So you do have a handout. We don't have PowerPoint, but we do have a handout. So I think it's just useful. Some of this stuff, it's so much easier when you see it to follow. So this is our handout. So I'm going to walk through some of this. And like I said, I'll try to keep it short. So the first chart or slide you have there, and all of this stuff is available on our website if you want more information about any of it. But we really think about the budget process, and I think you've heard you heard Amy talking about, it starts in the House, it moves to the Senate. But I think the thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that there's an opportunity for public input into when the governor is developing the budget, before it's put out to the legislature, before the governor makes a recommendation, and that usually happens in November. Now, the way that input has been collected has varied over the years, and sometimes it's easier than others to get your voice heard. They've done a couple of webinars. They used to do public meetings. This year they did an online survey. So there's a lot of different ways, but I think that's a really critical point at which your voices could be heard. It's important to come and talk to the legislators and talk to the legislature, but before the governor's budget comes out is really a critical time, because usually, and it may be different this year, kind of all bets are off this year with the new leadership and divided government and all that, but typically the legislature does not make that many changes to the governor's proposal. There's arguing sometimes about the way that they do it, but the base programs, the base funding is usually pretty easy to agree on. And so a lot of the fighting is kind of around the edges. Sometimes it's technique, but sometimes, it's relatively small pieces of it once it gets to that point. So the governor and the administration do a lot of the work before that budget is released. So I think that's a really important piece. So real quickly, these pie charts I think pie charts just give you a sense of, what's the relative share of things. So the two biggest functions of government are, of course, healthcare and education. So you see that we spend 43% on human services. So total budget, $5.8 billion. That includes all funds, about a third on education. And then so everything else is a third. So that just kind of gives you an idea. And then the next page, the next pie chart, is where the funds come from. So I think, the fear about losing federal funding is significant, because you've got about 35% of our state budget is federal funds. And so, that would have a real impact. And it has had in the past, sequestration and at other points when there have been federal cuts, that does have a real impact on what we're able to do. And a lot of this, the healthcare stuff, kind of all bets are off with healthcare, but if there were changes at the federal level, it would have a significant impact on Vermont. But the other point that I want to make here is that whenever we talk about the general fund, or we talk about the budget gap, we're talking about the general fund, which is a quarter of the budget. So it's a relatively small piece. And to balance the general fund, what often happens is that things get moved in or out of the general fund. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're saving a cost somewhere or really cutting something somewhere, although sometimes it does. But it sometimes just means that we're shifting it somewhere else. And so when we just focus on the general fund, we're kind of missing some of the picture, I think. So just so you're aware that that's how that works. So I think you heard Amy say, and maybe Senator Ash, $60, $70 million budget gap. We've had budget gaps pretty much every year since the recession, and so we kind of keep coming back, and they've varied in size, and sometimes, 30 million, 100 million. And, again, the ballpark, the general fund is about $1.5 billion. So if you're talking about a $30 million gap, in any given year, there's sort of a little bit of churn. But when you start to get in the $100 million range, you start to really, have real cuts that you have to make, or real decisions that you have to make around that. So, the House has been kind of whittling that down, partly by basically rejecting any of the governor's new initiatives, among other things. And then there has been some, there's been a resistance to using one-time revenue, but that does come into it some of the time. And, but the bottom line is that we've had these gaps every year, and we're not solving the underlying issue. We're just going to keep coming back to this problem of having these gaps if we don't do something about the underlying problems. So the next chart is what we would see. This is sort of the historical context for some of these, for where we are in the budget. And so that next chart, what you can see is that since 2000, so the red line, the revenue growth is not keeping up with the economy. And you can see that that's a change since 2000. So before 2000, that red line pretty much stayed the same. You don't expect it to be identical, but you expect it to kind of keep up, that revenue is capturing a share of what's going on in the economy. That's the idea. That's what our tax system is. It's, sales tax, it's income tax, it's what's going on in the economy should be captured by our revenue system. And since 2000, that's not happening. You can see those two big drops. Those are the recessions. So there's something has happened since 2000 that's changed, because there were recessions in the 80s and 90s, but that wasn't happening. And the reason for that, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the way our economy works now has changed, right? So the way we make money, the way, we can generate a lot more goods and services without as many jobs. So, a lot happens, and so that gets disconnected. But then the other piece of it is that, it was before my time, but that there were governors that were willing to look at the revenue side. So this also covers Governor Snelling's temporary tax increases. So when, in times of low revenues, there was a willingness to look at and consider a temporary fix, acknowledging that this, what we call the countercyclical problem, which is that the demand for government services goes up when the economy is bad. So food stamps, Medicaid, all of these things, people need more of when the economy is bad, not less. So that pulling back in times of recession is actually the worst thing that government could do. So that's sort of a kind of long-term picture of where revenues are. The next piece is what Jessica and a couple of other people were talking about, this healthcare piece, and Senator Ash as well. The healthcare piece is that, healthcare is eating up more and more of the state budget. And some of that is a good thing, because we do have some of the best coverage rates, and we made the decision that we want to cover people. And actually, Vermont was ahead of the game in terms of Medicaid expansion, in terms of covering more people and more families and children in particular. But the bottom line is that if you look at the red columns, that's everything else in state government. So everything else in state government is staying the same or shrinking, because all of the growth in the state budget is being sucked up by the healthcare spending. So, we do have, we have the Green Mountain Care Board, whose goal is to reduce that. And so, some of that cost is because of we've expanded to more people, we're covering more people. So when we look at the whole system of healthcare spending, not just what the state is spending, but what sort of everybody is spending to pay for healthcare for Vermonters, that's actually coming down. But the challenge is, that the rate of healthcare spending is still going up higher than is really sustainable. So I think everybody sort of has this sense that the rate of spending is growing too fast, and that's what the Green Mountain Care Board's role is, to kind of bring that curve down. But the challenge is that in the meantime, the rest of state government gets squeezed, and we need to address that. So again, real quickly, the next few charts are from our State of Working Vermont reports, and we issue this report at the end of every year, and it's exactly that. It's really looking at how working Vermonters are doing, what's happening in the workforce, and what are some trends that have an impact on Vermonters and or the state budget. So this next chart, you see this idea that this is another way in which our economy has changed, and that is that income inequality is getting worse. And so since the 70s, income inequality has been on the rise, and what that means is a greater and greater share of income is going to the top 1%. So again, for the rest of Vermonters, you can see on the next chart there, the incomes are pretty stuck. So this is by quintile, so sort of lower income, lower earning Vermonters, and then the blue line is your sort of middle earning Vermonters. You can see that the lower income aren't even back to where they were before the recession. So we're still recovering lost ground. We're not sort of getting ahead. And median household income has basically been stagnant since 2000. So we're really not growing. But at the top, they're doing okay. At the top 5%, you know, their incomes are growing. So it kind of gives you some context to see when we start to talk about whether Vermont has an affordability problem and sort of what are the challenges facing Vermonters, this is what it looks like, is that our incomes are relatively stagnant, but the cost of other things, childcare, healthcare, college, all these other things continue to go up. So, you know, it is getting less affordable. Now, I appreciate Jessica's optimism and wanting to focus on what we're doing well, and I think there are a lot of things that we're doing well, and, you know, thinking about what is the value we get for those other state services is important to, you know, think about what we get for that, for education spending and for some of the healthcare spending and what we're able to do with that. But, you know, so there is this sort of two Vermont aspect, right? And this is why we talk about one Vermont, and we talk about having equal access to opportunity, because, you know, we do have a population, the majority of the population, for whom things are getting tighter and more challenging. And then we have a population where they're doing fine, and we start to think about how, you know, how the economy has changed, and that's one of the ways. So when in this building, when they talk about how to solve the budget gap, there's usually two pieces to solving the budget gap, or there's two options, right? One option is more budget cuts, and the other option is raising revenue. So those are sort of the two classic places to look. And there's two types of expenditures that I just want to call to your attention, because I think we spend a lot of time focusing on appropriated expenditures, which is exactly probably what all, you know, what we're familiar with, which is this is the state budget. This is the bill that says this is how much we're spending on each of these programs. And excuse me, I'm going to need to cough. Excuse me. But the other side of it is tax expenditures, and, you know, that's where we choose not to collect money. And that's something that we should look at too, and we don't look at every year to the extent, to the extent that we look at, it's the worst when your cough drop melts, when your paper melts to your cough drop.
To the extent that we look at expenditures.
Right, so every year we do the state budget, and then we do have a study, and a lot of this stuff was recommended by the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission, who issued their final report 5 years ago about what we needed to do to improve our revenue system to make it more sustainable. And looking at tax expenditures was a big chunk of that, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars every year that we choose not to collect. And not all of those are focused on upper income, but a lot of those, the value is higher for upper income folks. You know, something like the sales tax exemption on food, I don't think anybody is looking to change, and that's a big chunk. But there's other things where, particularly the way that we calculate Vermont taxable income is a place where Vermont is one of only 7 states that uses this sort of lower base from the federal level than other states. Most states use a higher base, and that allows them to have lower marginal rates. I know I'm getting a little into the weeds here, but the bottom line is that we need to look at both of those types of expenditures more regularly. And then on the revenue side, obviously, you know, the options are new fees, new taxes, or raising the ones that we have. And I think you know that's going to be a challenge. We have an administration who has sort of drawn a pretty hard line in the sand on that. So, you know, we'll see if there's any room for conversation on that front. But that's what I have. I hope that was reasonably quick, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, we have time for a question, if anyone has questions. We've been, Angelica, yeah.
Hi, I'm from CTV. I was just wondering if you had any information about the philanthropic funding trends over the last few years. If we see that 1% making so much in Vermont, are they giving a bigger chunk of that back, maybe? And will they? I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if we track it in that way. I don't know who would have those data.
Christopher, do you know? No, we can find
I could pretend that I knew, but I don't. But you probably have more numbers than any of us.
We might.
There are, you can actually track, you can look at the charitable deductions that is actually reported on the tax returns, the percentage of charitable deductions, so we could pull that, and I haven't seen the numbers for a couple of years. We could pull that out. Any other final question? So I think we've gotten a good kind of briefing on some of the key issues that are happening in the legislature, and I hope that Stephanie's dive into the budget gives you an idea of how to think and look at the budget when you're bemoaning whether your program's being cut or you're trying to understand what kind of decisions the legislature is trying to make. And really they are dealing now with 1% of the budget, as Tim talked about before, and the healthcare costs are eating up a huge portion of our budget. And unless you're at the table talking about the issues you are concerned about and the funding that you're concerned about, legislators aren't going to do anything to support you if they don't hear from us. So that's, I think, another key message.
You're on the table.
Right.
You're not at the table.
You're on the table if you're not at the table. Jessica, Oski, and Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.